conversation between Jesus and Peter as recounted in the Gospel of John, the 21st chapter. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper. When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me." Let us bow for a moment. Lift from us the words that have bombarded us through time now, words of concerns and problems and tasks, that we may come available to the one word which is our hope and our strength and life. In the Spirit of Jesus, Amen. Old Moses, just before his death, pleads with his people to choose life. What a strange thing to say on the face of it. Is life automatic? Isn't it a given? I'm alive because years ago, through a process that even the youngest now seems to understand, I one day came into being, came alive, and one day, just as surely as I stand here, I shall cease to live, I shall die. How is it possible to talk about choosing life? How is it possible to say, I live, really live, only if I make a deliberate choice today? The words suggest, of course, that there is a life that is more than my heart beating and my lungs expanding and contracting. And with only a moment's reflection, I think we all recognize that this is in fact the case. A cartoon in the New Yorker magazine makes the point. Picture of a sedentary fellow, a typical couch potato, slumped in his chair, staring vacantly out the window. Behind him on the sofa sits his wife with a friend, and the wife is saying, "You know, last week I think he had a near-life experience." So, real human, you know him. Real human life is more than biological. We say of someone, he certainly has a lot of vitality, or she is full of life. And when we talk in this way, we do make clear that life is a matter of quality, of energy, of enthusiasm. And I trust we all want to be fully alive in that sense. We all want to live with intensity and spirit, be more than just the walking dead. But is this finally a matter of choice? This old faith insists that it is. A life of spirit and enthusiasm and intensity and vitality comes only as we make again and again certain kinds of choices, decide for a certain way of being in this world. Moses couples the choice for life with a choice to live by certain commandments, statutes, ordinances, archaic words, I admit, not very inviting, I admit. But this ancient way insists that only as we choose a certain kind of structure for our lives, a certain path, consisting of moral standards and good habits and sound principles, will we end up alive, rather than over time dissipated, confused, dead on our feet. Let's face it, though, this runs counter to a very pervasive view of life in the culture out there that does not believe that we have any such real choice. This view, in one mixture or another, attributes our life, what we are, what we can do, to forces quite beyond our control. We are in no way free to choose who we shall be and who we shall become. A certain kind of social science has bred the belief in many of us, especially intellectual elites, that human beings are pretty much and exclusively almost the products, the victims of their genes on the one hand, or their environment on the other. This assignment of human dysfunction and failure to causes outside the self is rather pervasive. Not hard to illustrate how imbued we've all become to some measure with this perspective whenever we run into aberrant behavior, whether it's an unmarried teenager on the south side or the affluent teen killer on the north side. What do we ask? Why? Why did he do it? And invariably we come up with some explanation outside the self, outside the moral core of the person, do we not? wretched conditions, bad parenting. If somebody answered the question why by saying, well, maybe he decided to do it, we would wonder where on earth he came from. Decision and hence responsibility is not a legitimate explanation any longer for human behavior. It's not considered a real factor. John Leo, the columnist, tells of an interview he gave on a St. Louis radio talk show right after the Jonesboro shootings. You remember 2 boys shot up several classmates. Why did the Jonesboro massacre happen was the question of the talk show. Guns, television violence, popular culture drew early and predictable blame. Some commentators seemed eager to blame parents. Others thought the school was at fault. A reporter for a major paper couldn't resist applying her gender theories. The boys may have been influenced by the many men they heard talking about killing their wives and friends. Strange lot. Inevitably, the commentary made the shooters seem like helpless victims of an irresistible popular culture. University of Kentucky researcher even weighed in with a syndrome known as fledgling psychopathy. The result, he said, of hyperactivity, interacting with an emotional disorder, expressing itself inevitably in fighting, cruelty, and truancy. In other words, they were sick. Now, of course, both heredity and environment set some limits upon our freedom. They do. They impact upon what we shall achieve and become as human beings, and it would be foolish to deny this. And we have a responsibility as God gives us resources and power to ameliorate the terrible conditions under which many are born and must grow to adulthood, and especially those who are trapped in a sick mind or perhaps a sick body. But this is not the problem. The problem is a pervasive attitude and message promulgated by pop psychologists, social scientists, and the talking heads that we are nothing but victims of our circumstance, past or present, inevitably enslaved by a dysfunctional family and bad parenting, by too much or too little of earthly means, by prejudice, poor education, the alcoholic, by a host of external factors and forces that have borne in on us over the years and have, quote unquote, made us who we are. And the result is a pessimistic determinism that is far worse than any Calvinist predestination ever brewed. And the result, I think, is not only a failure on the part of many to accept responsibility for their lives, it is the growing belief that we cannot rise above our circumstance, really have no choice or hope in life. Dr. Laura Schlesinger is not exactly my favorite commentator, but I think she put it quite rightly when she said, "Call me a heretic, but I believe that even the bad stuff in your past does not eliminate choices. Everyone must overcome something. That simply is life." Of course, the typical rejoinder is, how dare you blame the victim for his unhappiness? But there's a big difference between blaming the victim and trying to get across the fact that it is still within his power to gather courage and move on. Nobody is acknowledged to have free will or responsibility anymore. We've become a nation of excuses, of victimization, which is, as someone has said, today's promised land of absolution from personal responsibility. Frank and Ernest cartoon shows 2 bums sitting along a wall conversing. One says to the other, "Do you believe in fate? Do you believe in predestination?" The other replies, "Sure do. I'd hate to think I'd turn out like this if it's something I had control over." The real problem is not one of passing judgment on others, friends. It's a word directly to each one of us. You know, Peter wants to know, after Jesus has challenged him in this little conversation, Peter suddenly wants to know, what about that guy? And Jesus says to him, in effect, what business is that of yours? And Jesus invites him to follow him. It's the problem of a people, often as privileged as poor, convinced that they can no longer control their life in any decisive way. The idea that we are not free to live intentionally, to choose the path we take, is a pernicious idea. In fact, if we buy into it, it robs us of our humanity. Its attraction, of course, lies in the fact that if I have no control over my destiny, I can't be blamed for it either, can I? The thought that I determine where I end up, that I'm finally responsible for my life, is frankly scary and threatening. The result, for example, is young people, adults who have no idea why they are, where they are, who never deliberately reflect and decide. To my eye, a vast number of our young people who end up in college give every appearance of being there. Why? Well, because it's expected of them, and it's one way to get away from mom and dad. Bob Kuchenberg, one of the all-time great players in the history of the Miami Dolphins, was once asked why he had gone to college. And in a Newsweek magazine interview, he said, "My father and uncle were human cannonballs in carnivals. My father told me, go to college or be a cannonball. Then one day, my uncle came out of the cannon, missed the net, and hit the Ferris wheel. I went to college." There's a marvelous moment in Chaim Potok's novel, The Chosen, semi-autobiographical, where the rabbi is speaking to his son who has lost the sight of one of his eyes through an accident at play. "You are no longer a child, Reuven. It's almost impossible to see the way your mind is growing and your heart too. 3 years ago, you were a child. You've become a small giant since the day Danny's ball struck you in the eye. You may not see it, but I see it, and it's a beautiful thing to see. So listen to what I want to tell you." Rabbi pauses for a moment as if considering his words carefully, and then he continues, "Human beings do not live forever, Reuven. We live less than the time it takes to blink an eye, if we measure our lives against eternity." So it may be asked, what value is there in a human life? There's so much pain in the world. What does it mean to have to suffer so much if our lives are nothing more than the blink of an eye? He paused again, his eyes misty now, and then he went on, "I learned a long time ago, Reuven, that a blink of an eye is itself nothing. But the eye that blinks, that is something. A span of life is nothing. But the man who lives that span of life, he is something. He can fill that tiny span with great meaning." Do you understand what I'm saying, Reuven? He is saying, is he not, that free human beings are human beings who use their freedom responsibly to decide life within the limits that heritage and circumstance impose upon us. He does not simply drift through his days. He does not just go through the motions. He does not just follow some unexamined script. He does not let others shape him. He lives intentionally as he can all the way to the end. Thank God the tide is beginning to turn even in the research community. Less and less deterministic. In his latest volume, Authentic Happiness, Dr. Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, a respected research scientist and scholar, tells how the epiphany happened to him. By the way, I commend the book to you. He was weeding the garden with his 5-year-old daughter, Nikki. He writes, "I'm goal-oriented and time-urgent, and when I'm weeding in the garden, I am weeding in the garden." Nikki, however, was throwing weeds into the air and dancing and singing, and since she was distracting me, I yelled at her and she walked away. Within a few minutes, she was back, saying, "Daddy, I want to talk to you." "Yes, Nikki." "Daddy, do you remember before my 5th birthday, from when I was 3 until I was 5, I was a whiner. I whined every day. On my 5th birthday, I decided I wasn't going to whine anymore. That was the hardest thing I've ever done. And if I can stop whining, you can stop being such a grouch." In that moment, the good doctor writes, I resolved to change. So we do have a measure of freedom to change, to grow, to be different all the way in our life. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist, philosopher who died in Vienna at the age of 92, wrote a little volume called Man's Search for Meaning out of his experience in the concentration camps. Sold more than 2 million copies now in its 73rd edition. It's been translated into 26 languages. He is gone, but his ideas will live on. Listen to him. We who lived in concentration camps can remember the people who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last crust of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof, as far as I'm concerned, that everything can be taken from a person but one thing: the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. There are always choices to be made. Every day, every hour, you are offered the opportunity to make a decision which determines whether you will or will not submit to those powers which threaten to rob you of yourself, your inner freedom, which determines whether or not you will become the plaything of circumstance, renouncing dignity. Fundamentally, any man, any person can, even under such circumstances, decide what shall become of him in his mind and his heart. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz, but man is that being who entered those gas chambers erect, with the words on his lip, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God, and him only shalt thou serve." Raises an interesting question, though, as to where that freedom comes from. Is it just natural to us? It's there on the table for us, or is there something else here? Is it perhaps a gift to those who are available to the will and grace of God? I find the encounter between Jesus and Peter by the seaside incredibly helpful, because Peter at that moment in time is not free. He's frozen in his guilt. He deserted his friend in the moment of greatest trial, and yet here that friend is again, asking Peter if he still cares, if he's still with him. And it is the words of Jesus, those words of sheer grace, the embrace on the part of Jesus, that liberates Peter from the paralysis of fear and failure to decide for life again. And I think that's sort of the way it is. Homely example. Think of a 6-year-old confronted with a strange new babysitter. The child is anxious and afraid and rather cowers on one side of the room. Can she decide for this stranger in her living room? Can she trust her? Not really. Not at the beginning. In her anxiety, she's quite paralyzed. She's unable to reach out until what? The sitter does something, smiles, offers her a gift of affection and acceptance, or some small token of love that she's brought with her. And then the child is freed up to slowly but surely move toward her new ward. The experience of an unexpected graciousness enables her to decide for friendship and joy. And I think it's a lot that way in life. God's love is not the violation of our freedom. He does not dominate and determine. The embrace of His grace is the freedom to decide for life. Dr. Larry Baker became totally blind due to a viral infection when he was 25. When the physician told Baker, "I'm afraid I have to tell you something that will affect the whole rest of your life. You're never going to see again." Baker sat there silent for some time, and finally he replied, "Doctor, I understand what you're saying, but with God's help, I will determine the effect it has on my life." Baker, married with 3 children and working in the family business, when he lost his sight, described himself in high school as a member of that 1/3 of the class which made the other 2/3 of the class look great. But taking advantage of a scholarship offered to persons with sight abilities, Baker entered Indiana University and received a bachelor's degree, graduating 5th in a class of 780. He received the Presidential Achievement Award, decided to go on and earn his master's and doctor's degree in business administration, became a university professor for 10 years, then formed his own company, and blind Dr. Baker went on to present management seminars internationally. His secret, a decision for life beyond himself and his handicap. And he said something interesting one time. He said, "Everybody has some disability, But the most severe disability I ever encounter are people who are paralyzed from the neck up. Nobody ever failed by giving in life. Have faith in God and therefore in yourself and decide for your mission. But this decisive, intentional living does not need to fade with the years. It is good forever. An older woman, another example, by the name of Jean Ronan, writes, "My husband and I decided with retirement that we would not simply drift. So we do volunteer work in hospitals, we read for the blind, we help prepare task forms, we even work at underpaid jobs a little to augment our income. Yes, I'm a senior, but I swim half a mile each day during the summer months, and during the winter I ride an exercise bicycle several miles each day. The point I'm trying to make," she goes on, "is that we are intentional people. There are some who will say, that's fine as long as you have your health. True enough, but to set the record straight, my husband is diabetic and I have had to have 2 hip replacements. And recently I decided to learn how to use a computer. So now I'm a freelance writer. That's someone who's unemployed and unpaid and ever optimistic, hoping things will turn around." Choose life. The day, the labors, the loves, choose life so that both you and your children and your grandchildren may live, because they're watching